Today, I'm going to be talking about the case for cloud-based DevOps. First of all, why and what are the benefits for it? Recognizing that changing the organization is actually a really key critical to success with DevOps adoption. Looking at the role of a cloud center of excellence, which has been a way to successfully implement at scale and how that needs to work to be able to function and get the goals we're looking for. And then getting into the details in the proposal of our plan for how to enable cloud-based DevOps at scale. So over the last decade, we've increasingly seen the benefits of DevOps to increase agility, speed time to market, and increase business flexibility. And it's increasingly recognized across across clients in terms of the value it can bring, especially when further powered by the power of cloud. Yet, according to research from the DevOps Institute, the DevOps journey is still very difficult for more than 50%, moving the conversation from why should I do this to how do I successfully do it and how do I move forward? The benefits of cloud-based DevOps, as I said, are pretty well known, but let's just take a moment to go through them. From a business perspective, most importantly, they can accelerate outcomes for the business and improve performance, drive further value for the business. For operations, it can go ahead and simplify, particularly when implemented at scale and moving beyond pilot projects to a larger footprint of the application space. For developers, once you've got the cloud-based DevOps enablement, it improves their ability to do their jobs without having to rely on each and every one becoming DevOps experts. And from a security perspective, once you have cloud-based DevOps implemented at scale, you can ensure that you're enforcing security best practices repeatedly and reliably. So when you get to DevOps at scale, you move away from something that was really kind of technically challenging, unique, and a bit of a new thing to do, to something that's repeatable, safe, easy, and streamlined, similar to aircraft and how it used to be something entirely for adventurers. And now there's billions of people traveling every year with an estimated 500,000 in the year at any given point in time. And our biggest concern from safety perspective is more around the environment today and things that are going on with other people than the planes themselves. So this is all obvious. We should be implementing DevOps. Everyone knows that. Why is it so hard? And why is it still not something that has been implemented to the extent that businesses would like to? There's a lot of technical challenges around it and ways to address those and work through them, and we'll talk through some of those. And organizational change is also needed as teams figure out a new way of working together, and that's difficult as well. So we'll talk a little bit about just the principles of why that's the case and things that we've learned in terms of how to go ahead and more successfully drive that transformation. We did a survey of clients last year and separated those into those that were more leading with cloud-based DevOps adoption and others that were more in the mainstream of where they were, and found some interesting findings. For one thing, 60% admit that the technical challenges of moving DevOps applications to cloud are actually easier to deal with than the associated people-related challenges. And companies with a dedicated team were much more successful on average of migrating things to the cloud than those without. And 72% of leading cloud DevOps adopters acknowledged that it was difficult to create independence teams that use modern app lifecycle approaches and really required some work and thought on how to successfully do that. You look at the basic even principles of a DevOps team, and this is laid out from the DevOps handbook. They're very different from how we've traditionally done IT in terms of even team size. We love to have big teams working together from an overall organization perspective, the idea of silos and how that should be working. So there's a fundamental shift in how you expect people to work together from how they've done in the past when you move to DevOps adoption. And if you look back in terms of basic knowledge that we know from a business perspective outside of IT, changing organizations is hard. There's all sorts of people who spend all their time trying to help organizations do that. And there's for a few reasons that it's important just to think about when you're in the middle of trying to be one of the people going through this change and recognize and think about it as your job is changing. First one is principle of organizational inertia, which is the idea that organizations aren't just made up of people. They're made up with how those people work together, what the processes are in place, what the habits are, what our relationships are, what our culture is. And as all of that changes in terms of saying you used to work together one way and now you're going to work together another, that requires a lot of thought and care and effort to create new DNA and new relationships in place to replace the old ones. And if that doesn't happen, things tend to revert to the norm. So what you'll see a lot is people going through a principle of saying we're applying DevOps and sort of land on, in theory, on paper, you're working together in a DevOps manner, but in practice, people still work together the way that they always have because that's what they know and are comfortable with, and frankly, are comfortable as successful. And you get into a bit of a hybrid pattern of the two. So it's important to look out for that. Second principle I'll hit on is just the idea of natural boundaries. And this is the concept that when organizations shift from formal hardwired boundaries into open boundaries, which is one of the principles of DevOps, informal boundaries tend to appear, even if it wasn't intended in the design. And this is people figuring out how to form a team and kind of form their tribe based on what they're comfortable with, whether it's recognizing that someone's in a position of authority and still kind of deferring to them as a leader, even if the organizational design doesn't call for that and calls for more empowerment, or forming around tasks or around politics, internal politics, and thinking I'm with this org, so I still need to work with this team versus the DevOps team I'm on. And recognizing that and then carefully trying to break through that actually requires some effort and thought of everyone involved. So just to sum this section up, cultural adoption is really a key challenge when moving to DevOps, and it requires a lot of thought, including from senior leaders and their support and effort, measuring for success, paying attention to what we're doing, really focusing on group dynamics though, as well as hiring and training for the skills that are needed. So how do we go ahead and handle all this? What can we do? How can we go ahead and ensure that we can move forward with DevOps adoption? One really common tactic is the use of a Cloud COE, which of course is a cross-functional team with representation from dev, ops, security, networking, other fields, all pulled together in a relatively small group that's providing overall coaching and training across the organization. And so this is a pretty easy concept that a lot of companies try and go ahead and employ, and has been used very, very successfully to help drive change, but also you see some that are also struggling in terms of working with everyone. So what are some of the keys if you're part of a Cloud COE or forming one that are needed to make sure that it's successful? First of all, it needs to be treated as a consultancy and needs to be advertised and its value shown across the organization. It also needs to be consisting of people that really own and embody the principle of continuous learning and change, which is so critical to the organization and cloud-based DevOps overall. So they need to be continuing to grow, learn, and adopt best practices and go ahead and model that behavior for the rest of the organization. Also, the CCOE should be the coach, helping others do the work, not the people doing the work themselves, because that doesn't scale. If you have them turning into the DevOps team themselves, it's not a scalable COE anymore. It's now a DevOps team. Using the right tools and being smart about what we're using across the enterprise. Keep it small. A COE should be a COE, otherwise it turns into the team itself. And go ahead and not necessarily break rules, but be people who can go ahead and move forward, change, and drive new rules that are needed to enable DevOps at scale. A couple other things just from a people and organization perspective is generally not great to hire for the CCOE. If part of the point of the entire team is to be helping the rest of the organization learn and grow, it's a lot easier when it's one of you having that conversation. So we've very much looked to see if we can try and find people who are homegrown, part of the organization, and move them into those roles. And go ahead and look for people who might be top candidates with their great experience that can move into playing that role, maybe with a little bit of growth and learning on their side. And the most important thing about all of this is that they need to feel like they're part of the organization and not be kind of a siloed ivory tower off on the side. That's the most common theme that we've seen in terms of CCOEs that have really failed to drive successful change across the rest of the organization, is you end up over here with a really smart, agile, forward-looking, diving into cool technology, working in a certain way, and the rest of the organization is just not able to come along with them. And when that happens, that's when you have a failed CCOE. So diving into a little bit more detail, I'm going to talk through our patterns and our process for how to enable cloud-based DevOps at scale, which starts with planning and assessment and putting together a plan for how to go through from pilot all the way to scale. Start with step one, which is finding a pilot, working out the kinks. Step two is pattern identification and an analysis of the application portfolio to identify common patterns and figure out how you're going to go ahead and structure that. Step three, platform development and implementing a DevOps platform that can be used to scale across the organization. Pattern development comes next with step four. I just spent a little bit of time talking about the importance of processes and change. So that is step five, and making sure that that's a focus of the overall effort as well. And then kind of done, but then at that point, as with everything, you move into continuous innovation stage and are not really done, but continue to be set up to continue and grow going forward. So to talk through all of these in a little bit more detail. The first step is identifying a good pilot. And it's important to find one that will have good visibility, good value to the organization, but also give the ability to try out the kinks and make sure that you get this entire engine working the way that's needed. So there should also be a lot of strategic focus and support in terms of ensuring that this can go forward as the kinks are worked out. But then empowerment of the team itself to figure out how to function as a DevOps team and how to work through how they need to work together, because that's what's going to be needed to scale, is the empowerment piece as well. So those two need to come together. Have to form the team with the proper people, start with a good use case, ideally one that's going to meet an identified business need, because tying everything back to the benefits is really important on that first pilot project. And so go for the one with the largest business impact if possible. If everything, if there's no constraints from a technology side on that. And try not to implement too many things in the first pilot. Don't go too big. So 3 or 4 DevOps concepts is usually about the right number. And it does take a little thought and care to come up with the right pilot, because this is kind of a make or break thing. And it's the advertisement for the entire DevOps initiative. So we spend a lot of time trying to get up the right first one to work through, and then having that small cross-functional pilot team go forward and execute, building a pattern of lessons that will be learned as you go ahead and scale across the larger organization. So again, empower that pilot team, but then have folks keeping an eye on it and being aware of what's going on, because the larger message is one that we want to be successful to scale out with. Step 2 is pattern identification. And this is kind of the planning and where we're going to go to scale everything. So assessing the overall application portfolio and identifying applications that share common patterns. Ideally, these should be revenue generating applications. Again, high business value, because the lower ones tend to be less interesting from a transformation perspective. So not so much sustaining applications, but not a high TCO if you enact change. And that business view is important as well. And a shared pattern ultimately is the infrastructure template of a given application. Its server configuration is code, and its deployment process is code, and technology agnostic. So it's figuring out what are those common patterns across different applications in terms of how they will sit and interact with the cloud. And once you start clumping them together, you can go ahead and address them as a consistent group. So common patterns consist of infrastructure, whether it's AWS CloudFormation or HashiCorp Terraform, the software provisioning tool, lots of different options there, the process DSL, whether it's Jenkins or something else. The pattern definition should be a complete embodiment, including all of the infrastructure components and middleware dependencies, as well as the app itself, everything you need to deploy an application. And the Goldilocks principle comes into play here as well. Don't make them too big, don't make them too small. You got to get just right. And that is something we tend to learn in time. And overall, what we've seen is you can get up to 50 applications using a single pattern as you look to see how things can scale. So this allows you to go, instead of one-off ad hoc, every single application over time, start thinking in terms of scale, categorizing your applications and categorizing use cases underneath them that can be consistent. It moves us over to platform deployment, which is kind of the one thing you see on the slide the most is the DevOps platform, right? And from a technology perspective, a key piece of setup of moving to cloud-based DevOps at scale. So begin deploying technology, make decisions to modernize systems, use a cloud-based platform that includes technologies and processes for services, pipelines, a landing zone, and making sure that that IP is in place, inspectors, injectors, and seeing how they all work together within the flow of running from services, the pipelines, the landing zone, and all working together. The benefits of using a cloud DevOps platform include making sure that you've got a clear structure in your process as you're going ahead and adopting across the entire organization, and mapping the technologies to the DevOps process. And it ultimately ends up reducing risk, because what you have here is you might have certain individual folks who know very well what they're doing and have been piloting this whole DevOps thing from an application basis. But again, as you're going to scaling, you can't necessarily count on the training you're doing to have everyone be at the same level initially. So having the common platforms ensures that the scale will work, as you've got the foundational tools in place to support the specific expertise that's needed at the development layer. Then we get into pattern development. So you've identified your patterns, you've got your DevOps platform in place, and start needing to develop patterns that meet your requirements from an operations perspective, a security perspective, and a business perspective. The patterns need to be built with the appropriate interface level to ensure that they're easily consumed by the development teams. So just as with any other piece of development, you got to consider the use case and the user. In this case, the user is the development teams. It does require a bit of a mindset of pulling that application development side of framework over into creating this infrastructure as code, as opposed to a pure operations view of the world. Establish a pattern lifecycle management, ensuring that you don't just make them once, you're going to be keeping them up to date with the best practices. The team has to be structured to support that, incorporating new requirements as they come in, and with an eye to retiring patterns when appropriate, when they're no longer needed. As you start operating at scale, as with anything else, lifecycle management comes into play, and considering what is adding value and what is no longer adding value is also an important part of that. Looking at the Goldilocks principle again, in terms of applying just right controls around them, 5 to 20 patterns is ideal from what we've seen, depending on the size and the level of expertise within the development team. That can vary. And they won't address everything. They're going to address about 2/3, ideally, of the organization's applications. So there still will be work that falls outside of the support that the patterns are giving. But the idea is to kind of do not quite an 80-20 rule, but maybe a 60-70 in any case. And then process development was the fifth and last step we had in sort of the implementation program. And I spoke earlier about sort of the soft stuff about change and cultural change and how important that is. And it comes into play here with really making sure you get the processes in place, that you're training, equipping, and empowering the developers to understand the knowledge to assemble everything that they need to deliver a service, from code to configuration, the libraries, and the pipelines. So that can include formal classroom training is usually a good idea as these things are rolled out, making sure people get the right skills, and also in particular, the right way of working that you've decided upon as an organization, and instill the new culture of DevOps within the team. That doesn't tend to just happen on its own. It does require classroom training as well as coaching as you go, knowledge transfer and development. Really has to have a bit of investment of coaching to drive people who haven't done this in the past to get there and be thinking about it. And if you yourself are going through this, being open to the fact that you need ongoing coaching and continuous change, and continuing to look at what guidance you can find in terms of how to successfully be working in DevOps at scale if it's new for you. Evangelizing success, really helpful for the whole team to be coming along, publicizing it and getting the news out there. And then summits. Summits are great. They provide an opportunity to evangelize the importance and make sure that we're continuously learning, passing along new skills, new things coming out, and keeping the whole team together on the same page. So with all that, you've gone ahead, you've developed DevOps at scale. Done, never done with DevOps. So now you're at a point of continuous innovation. And this really needs to be embedded within the organization to have a culture of ongoing evolution and updates. We all know how fast technology is changing right now. We all know how fast innovation is going on. Every business is looking for it. It's a continuous topic. And so as you have the speed of innovation continuing to increase at every stage, it's really important to be keeping everything continuously in parallel with each other and moving forward with an eye of continuous change. So diving into that a little bit more, you've got development continuing to go with new code, using the pre-approved processes and infrastructure as code setup. The Dev and Ops team working together to continue using patterns and deploy new applications with self-service. Continue working together to look for new pattern opportunities, file change requests, and come up with new opportunities for new patterns for existing or new applications. Have the Cloud Center of Excellence continue to develop and certify new pattern changes, and they can be responsible then for working with InfoSec, the ops and devs teams to pull everything together in terms of the underlying structure supporting the overall organization. Both with ongoing reviews and having the structure in place for how to do that, and with an eye overall of continuing to evolve the overall platform and the overall organization. So these are some steps out there to go ahead and successfully implement cloud-based DevOps at scale based on the experience we've seen and have worked through with a number of customers over the last several years. Summarize again, I started off strong, educated, and engaged leadership really is critical here. But beyond that, then the whole organization needs to come together. So it's something that needs to be embodied and embraced by everyone within the team. Piloting and then growing, following the steps and the processes we walk through is usually the way to start. Get a good successful pilot out there, figure out how things are going to work, and then go ahead and scale that across the organization. cultural change is a real issue. So the whole team needs to be together, moving in the right direction and thinking about what needs to be done to think proactively and concretely about how do we work differently together under this new paradigm from how teams have worked together in the past. And then let's recognize, as I said a couple times, it's going to be continuous change. It's going to be an incremental progress. So it's important, first of all, to monitor how things are going, ensure that change continues, that the rollout continues, particularly as you get to later levels of scale where the challenges might become more because you got to the harder stuff later. And along the way, celebrate every incremental success.
Okay, thank you very much. And we are still with Emily from NTT Data Services. Emily, if you don't mind, I'd like to take some questions from the audience. And we have one from Bhupender Singh again. And I'm not a technologist, so I'll read it out and you make sense of what this really means, all right? So CI/CD vis-a-vis DevOps with respect to cloud-based microservice and container like Kubernetes Docker. I don't know if it's a question or it's a statement. Does that make sense? Can you say something?
It does make sense. It does sound a bit like a statement because I would agree that
okay.
a huge advantage of going ahead and moving to cloud-based DevOps at scale and adopting CI/CD is the ability to go ahead and implement and take advantage of Kubernetes, Docker, and other containers and continue to grow them at scale over time, which does go ahead and introduce some different challenges, different ways of operating. But moving to a microservices architecture is what leads to the ability to land that business agility and faster change that we spoke about as the benefit.
Okay, there's another one from Yash, and it says, key challenges to be taken care while moving from code to deployment.
Yeah, all of the assuring that you've got the proper real-time testing and ongoing active deployment processes are part of the setup that is so important. And that is one of the things of getting to scale that is important to be doing well, because when acting in a pilot environment or with developers on their own, going ahead and deploying their code out, that's relatively easy to do in a small focused manner, but you really have to have the underlying platform capabilities set up to go ahead and start scaling things and moving things into production while still ensuring you've got all the quality that you need every time.
Awesome. So audience, if there are any more questions for Emily, this is a good time to write them in the chat box, and I shall read them out for Emily. Let's give them a few more seconds, Emily, and if there are none, then we shall let you have a good morning. That, I think, is the end of questions then. Thank you very much, Emily, for the session, as well as for joining us to answer these questions. We really appreciate your time at NATC. Ladies and gentlemen, that is Emily Lewis-Pinnell, Vice President, NTT Data Services. Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.